Greetings, friends! Juan and Gruski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine, well, double weekly Russian-Ukraine war update for the week of September 9th through the 22nd of September of 2024. So yes, this is a 2-week special because I didn't do a episode last week, so we'll be going over the events that happened in the last 2 weeks. Now, before I begin, I am a bit sick. Actually, I'm pretty sick as fuck right now. I have a fever, and I'm like, so I might, if I like sneeze or cough or like have to like clear my throat, I apologize in advance. But besides that, we will now be talking about all the sick gains. See what I did there? Just kidding, that was cringe as fuck. Look at all the, we're going to go over the gains that Russia and Ukraine has been happening in the war in the last 2 weeks. So first of all, we're going to go in our favorite area, the Pokrovsk direction. This is where the biggest action is, and this is also where a lot of the, this is kind of where the main effort has been focused, but there's actually been a ton of updates everywhere. One of the biggest updates that happened in the last 2 weeks is the fall of Ukrainsk. This area right here, this is like a mining town. You can see the Terracon has been captured. And when we last left off, it looked like the Russians were about to storm the town. Like they were, I believe they were entering Listovka. They were right on the northern outskirts. But over the last 2 weeks, they managed to storm and capture Ukrainsk pretty much in about a week and a half of fighting, which was pretty fast. And the Ukrainians gave a fight, but they were overrun. So Ukrainians gives the Russians a Terracon. Again, these Terracons are very important because they give them that dominant height advantage, overlooking everything in this area. So this allows the Russians to continue advancing. And Ukrainians gives them a springboard to attack towards the next town, Tuskorinka here. This is where the next Russian advance will be put, and Ukrainsk was the first step to getting there. I'm going to go over kind of the main modus operandi of what the Russians are doing at the Kursk front. I just wanted to go over kind of the actual changes on the ground. Along with this, we talked about Selidova. The Ukrainians are in central Selidova itself. However, in the kind of the eastern outskirts, in the kind of this area right here. This is like some like low-rise, one-story residential buildings. They call it Mikhailovka, but it's basically part of Selidov because it bleeds into each other. So the Russians have complete control over Mikhailovka, but central Selidov itself, with all its high-rise buildings and such, are controlled by the Ukrainians. However, because of the fall of Ukrainians, the Russians are now able to attack Selidova from the south here. Because of this, the Russians have advanced and have cleared the fields. So the Russians were here, and with the fall of Ukrainians, they were able to clear the fields that were to the south of it, which were a big pain because, if they want to continue pushing towards Selidova, they have to secure their flanks here. So these fields to the south of Mikhailovka, Selidova, etc. have been taken, and now the clashes are going on for this other mine right here. So right now the Russians are battling for this mine right here, and some pro-Russian sources say this has been captured. Even pro-Ukrainian sources admit that the battles are going on for here. So we don't have 100% confirmation, though, that the Russians have fully captured this, like we have in Ukrainsk. But again, to capture this will give the Russians a springboard to start attacking Selidov from the south here. And again, they'll do kind of like what they did in kind of the north here, as they moved along the rail line here. They moved along this rail line to capture Novigorivka. This is what I believe they're going to do in the southern part of the Pokrovsk front. They're going to reach this rail line. You can see the rail line right here. And so once they capture this, they'll reach the rail line, and then they have two directions that I think they'll go to. So first, they could go to the north here and cut off Selidova from the back here, and this could cut the defenders of Selidova off. The other way is that they're going to move to the south here, try to take the town of Tuskorinka here, and move towards Kurakova. And I'll explain kind of what's the purpose of that in a moment here. But I'm going to go over kind of just like the general gain so far in this direction before I talk about that. The other thing is that the Russians have captured the village of Zelana Pershi. They have continued pushing down. However, the Ukrainians have a really strong fortifications here. They have the town of Gernik, the town of Kurakova here, not to be confused with Kurakova, but Kurakakivka, whatever the fuck. They have a bunch of mines here, big terracons. So this is a very strong industrial fortified area, and attacking this head on will be a bit of a headache for the Russians. And surprise, surprise, the Russians are here to cut off this area. Some sources are saying the Russians have like a small foothold in Gernik. They have captured a few buildings here. That might be possible. or then again, maybe the Russians, they'll probably get counterattacked, and maybe the Russians are just in the fields here between Ukrainsk and then the Russian positions that in these villages that they captured in the last few weeks or so. So Zlana of Persia has fallen. The fields between, the Nevesky pocket is slowly being crunched. We don't have any geolocated footage here yet, except that the Russians are here, so they captured, at least this area. But most mappers are saying that this pocket is slowly getting reduced because the Ukrainians are giving up this and retreating to Gernik and Kurovka to escape this pocket. So a lot of these fields have been taken by the Russians here. So slowly but surely, the Russians have to demine this and slowly get their grippings here. There's also another part of the Pokrovsk front, kind of like towards Pokrovsk itself. So the Pokrovsk direction is like the actual Pokrovsk direction in this area. But this actually is kind of where the Russians are now actually focusing. The main focus has been in the south here. And the main reason for that is to secure their flanks. Because if you spread out, if you kind of zoom out here, you could see that, generally speaking, the Russian front line, is pretty straight. But this kind of bulges out. You can see there's a bit of a bulge here. And so the Russians want to basically secure their flanks here and pull things up. Again, because if they continue advancing towards Pokrovsk, let's say they took it, then the entire, it'll be kind of looking like this, and you see there'll be just this giant, if they don't pull up their flanks, there's just this giant salient that the Ukrainians can attack on the flanks here. So they want to pull up the flanks, and the first thing they're focusing on is in the southern direction here. Now, before I talk about I talked about the gains in this kind of southern Pokrovsk direction, about in Ukrainsk and everything like that. And let's kind of go over in general about what's the plans for the Russians here. Now, before I do that, we need to kind of go from the Pokrovsk direction to the South Donetsk direction in this area. Now, before I begin, let's talk about Krasnogorivka. So last week, Krasnogorivka completely fell to the Russians. We talked about towards the tail end of the last week. They managed to capture these fields to the north of Krasnogorivka, and basically, once like a week or two ago, they captured basically the rest of these farms. Now, they basically secured themselves on the north, but what's actually most important is the big gains that the Russians are having to the west of Krasnogorivka. We can see that here, and this kind of goes tandem with what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. So the Russians have completely captured this area, and I believe they even captured this area. So this entire area was captured by the Russians. So these fields, the Russians pushed from Krasnogorivka and now are in the Vuhledar River defenses. So not only have they captured these fields, they also have captured the small town of Hostra. Now this has like some high-rise buildings and has some like things like that. So they captured this pretty quickly. And another big thing is that, the Russians, again, they used the rail lines to their advantage, and they're moving along this, and they fully captured the Selidova prison, this area right here. So they have fully secured themselves in this prison. And so the gains here are very big. We continue receiving confirmation the Russians are in the eastern part of Masklimanovka here, and they have also the Russians have captured this area right here. So they are connecting the roads in their gains in Hostra with, and also we got confirmation from the Russian Ministry of Defense that they have completely captured the village of Gridovka, but we already knew that. So what are the Russians doing here? So the Russians are going to be securing themselves along this rail line, clearing these fields to the north of Masklimanovka. Once this happens, the Russians will attack Masklimanovka from the north here and try to fully secure themselves in this village. So here's what the Russians are trying to do. The focus will be on Masklimanovka for the next week or two, and then they'll try to capture this. Now let's kind of go over and now that we know what the Russians have gained here, this is major gains. This is what the Russians have taken this week. So they captured the fields to the west of Krasnogorivka. They've captured Hostra. They've captured this prison. They're now gonna, are clearing the fields to the south here, and they're gonna try to storm Masklimanovka. So let's see what are the Russians trying to do here. So here's what the Russian plan is. So the Russians will try to push like this. So where are the Russians going to go after they capture Masklimanovka, after they storm it from the north? Well, again, the whole thing is I talked about the strong Ukrainian defenses with all these mines and these two big towns. There's even, I think, a factory here that the Ukrainians could use to guard themselves in or something. There's a lot of good areas here. Sorry. However, now that we know what's happening in Krasnogorivka, we could talk about what's going on in Ukrainsk. What are the Russians going to do here? So the Russians are going to be once they capture this and reach the rail line here. The Russians are going to try and storm the town of Tusurska here, and basically use this rail line to try to capture this town, try to capture this small mine here, and once they have this is the next goal for the Russians. Once they capture this town, then it's kind of a bit of a free reign. The Russians will continue pushing along the rail line. They'll try to secure themselves along Novosolodinivka here, in these two little villages here, and perhaps try to capture these farms to the west of the rail line here. And then from here, continue moving down along the rail line, and the two villages that are key is the village of Bresky here. This is where the Russians would try to aim for from the from the Pokrovsk direction, and from the Krasnogorivka direction, the main area, the main goal will be the village of Ostrovivka here. So here's the thing: the Russians still have a lot of things they need to do before they do it, but here's the end goal. The Russians want to push and reach the Kurakova-Vochka River Reservoir and take this village of Ostrovivka here. And once they reach here, they also want to reach the village of Bresky here. So, they'll have, positions here. So once this happens, the Ukrainians will have no positions to retreat from this area. This will become a cauldron here. And so the Ukrainians will have to give up Gernik, Kurovka, all these big mines, and, this could lead to big disasters for the Ukrainians here. And they'll have to retreat towards Kurakova. So that is kind of the big kind of end goal of the Russians here. They're trying to, and again, when this happens, then this pulls up the whole flank, because then they'll liquidate the pocket, and then again, this entire area gets pulled up, and this secures the flanks even better for the Russians. And so that is kind of the main goal, is to is to push down along these fields here, to push from here, and then liquidate this pocket without having to fight for these giant towns. And then from there, this pulls up the southern flank where they can continue the advance towards Pokrovsk. So that's the overall arching goal of the Russians here, and I kind of talked about kind of the gains happening in this area. Now let's talk about the rest of the Pokrovsk direction, because there's been some changes here. So one of the biggest is that the town of Gorodivka has been 95% captured by the Russians. We have geolocated footage of the Russians being, on the northern part here, in the western part here. Pro-Ukrainian mappers have this part as under Russian control. So I think the entire town has fallen for the most part. I don't know. I think there's maybe some farms here that are technically part of the town that aren't captured, but for the most part, the entire town of Gorodivka has been taken. This is important because this in the northern in this kind of north direction here, this gives the Russians a good defensive note here, and as a springboard towards Minograd. They've been battling for Gorodivka for a little bit of a while, and the Ukrainians keep doing counterattacks, but the Russians have now secured themselves in this town and are now holding it. We also have a bit of a back and forth here. As we saw last time, we thought that the Russians were in control of Mykolaiivka, Krasnoyar, and Kurtyar, but this was a bit of a premature thing. The Ukrainians basically have a bunch of trench positions in the south of Minograd and Pokrovsk here. So they're holding this line that are to the south of these two cities. And basically, the goal is that they're trying to basically prevent the Russians from developing their own defense line. So, with the capture of Novy-Gorivka, the capture of Gordivka, this gives Russians a supply base, just as they used Orchechny as a place to develop their offensive. In the western direction, they're going to use Novy-Gorivka and Gordivka as a springboard towards Pokrovsk. And basically, the Ukrainians are trying to do spoiling attacks to try to, prevent the Russians from securing themselves here. So we saw about a week ago, we saw that the Ukrainian tanks were here, and the Russians were bombing them. But then about a few days ago, we saw that the Russians were geolocated, getting droned in Kurtyar. And so this area right here, Krasnoyar and Kurtyar, is a bit of a contested zone, so they're not completely secured. But I think this map kind of shows exactly kind of what we're seeing here. So Mykolaiivka is kind of integrated with all the trench networks that are to the south of Pokrovsk, so obviously this village is still under Ukrainian control. Krasnoyar is not controlled by anyone. It's kind of like this no man's land. So if the Ukrainians wanted to attack, they could pass Krasnoyar pretty easily. But Kurtyar is very much still like kind of in Russian control, because the Russians are in control of this Terracon here. They are in the north here, so it's pretty good that the Kurtayar is probably under Russian control, though it's maybe a bit unstable. Um, so the Russians are basically trying to develop some sort of defense between Gorivka and Novy Gorivka. This is kind of the more weaker defense, because obviously these are two towns which could have good defenses. But in the middle here, this is where the battles are going on, because the Ukrainians are trying to unhinge the Russian defenses between Novy Gorivka and Gorivka. We also see that the Russians are improving their positions to the west of Novy Gorivka. Sources are saying they have finally captured this Terracon, or this like kind of mining area right here, which gives them a better position to protect the western flank of Novy Gorivka. And some sources are saying that the Russians are trying to push towards Suzka Yar and Listivskaya here, but so far they have not actually entered these two villages themselves. But a lot of these fields between this Terracon and this Terracon have been captured, and these are like kind of like protect the western part of Novy Gorivka. Sorry about that. Oop. Yeah, alrighty. So, that is the Pokrovsk direction. I think the Russians are trying to pull up the flank here, and then from there, my main thing is that they're going to then focus on Selidova. So let's say once they liquidate this pocket, they're going to focus, maybe at the same time, move along this rail line and try to capture Selidova, cut it off, and then capture. Because with the capture this town, or this, basically, yeah, this city almost, this gives the Russians another supply base to move along this rail line. And then, this rail line leads to Pokrovsk. But then if they move along this rail line, they can liquidate all the, villages that are in this area. And then suddenly the Russian front line will go something like this. Let me rewrite it here. So then the Russian front line will go something like this. And then this reaches them to the southern part of Pokrovsk. Because right now, they're not really, they're close to Pokrovsk. But right now, they're actually battling for Minigrad. Right now the battles are going on for the outskirts of Minigrad, but Pokrovsk is still a little bit more to the west here. But if they reach this rail line, then they'll start battling for the southern part of Pokrovsk itself. So I think, they're going to try to clear up this area to the south here. They're going to try to take Selidova, and then, clear these villages. And from there, then they could start advancing into Minigrad, Pokrovsk from the south. So that's the Pokrovsk direction. Let's go down to the South Donetsk direction. This is where a lot of other gains have been happening in this war, and this is probably in tandem with what's happening in Pokrovsk, because as I said, each front supports each other. If there's a breakthrough on one front, this affects by definition another front as well, because then that puts them in a compromising position. Just as, for example, let's say the Ukrainians in Seversk will be a lot more affected. Will be very affected if, say, somehow the Russians manage to push the Oska River and capture this area and have captured Liman, and this makes Seversk, even though it's a separate part of the front, very much affected. So they're kind of interconnected, but this is even more so. Damn. This is even more so because. This is in tandem with trying to push and trying to pull the flanks up here towards Karakova as well, because if they could push from the south here, they could then battle for Karakova, and this could be a supply hub for the more southern part of the offensive here, and everything like that. So let's talk about Vuhledar. So last week, about 2 weeks ago, we talked about the fall of Pershisivka, we talked about the fall of Konstantinovka, and there's been a lot of big gains here as well this week. So one of the biggest things in the last 2 weeks is the complete capture of Vodana. And not only have the Russians completely captured Vodana, they are now battling for the coal mine number 3, this strong area right here. So right now, the Russians are half in control of it. The Ukrainians are part of it, but the battle for, the Russians are trying to capture this as fast, and if they capture it, this give, Vodana and these coal mines. Coal mine number 1 was another area that the Russians have taken. The Russians have captured this coal mine number 1. These are very important, because when the Russians stormed Vuhledar, about a year and a half ago, they were, the Russians attacked from Pavlovka and entered the dachas of Vuhledar, but then they were counterattacked by the Ukrainians and forced out. And so now that they've captured the mine and that they have captured Vodana, this eliminates the attack, the flanking attack. So the Russians could do an attack on Vuhledar, but I don't think they will do a direct attack. I think they're going to slowly try to constrict Vuhledar, and basically try to force the Ukrainians to retreat. And the next Ukrainian lines of defense is in Charkovsky, Nova Ukrainka, and Bogdanovka here. And so the Russians are slowly but surely trying to reach these three villages and basically link up the Vodana and Pershistlivka areas and cut off Vuhledar. And then with the fall of Vuhledar, this gives them the dominant position to start advancing towards Bogdanovka and Nova Ukrainka here. Some other gains in this area, so the Russians have taken the fields to the west of Pershistlivka and are continuing slowly advancing towards Zolota Nova. We also have some geolocated footage that the Russians have crossed the river. So there's a river that goes between Zolota Nova, Pavlovka. There's this natural river defense, and the Russians have crossed it and have captured some of these fields to the north of Pershistlivka here. And so it looks like they're trying to develop a bridgehead here as they try to reach Nova Ukrainka, and probably even try to advance northeast here. So the encirclement of Vuhledar is continuing, and we shall see if the Russians continue developing their advances through the fields here. Now again, it took them a lot of weeks to advance from, to try to clear these fields right here. So it might take, and especially now that the weather is becoming more rainy and things like that, this might make advances in these fields a lot more unpredictable here. So, because they're not just fighting along the roads, they're fighting literally in the fields, and this might make the fields a lot more wet and, very much a bad choice to make. So the Russians might slow down here, but we shall see if they continue making advances here. We also have some more gains in Konstantinovka, so we talked about the complete capture of Konstantinovka. The Russians are now pushing beyond it, have captured this area right here of Konstantinovka, so they're now advancing beyond it towards the next Ukrainian villages of Antonovka and Kurtanivka here. The Russians also advanced and captured these fields right here beyond the highway, and the Russians will probably try to clear these fields very soon and to try to continue pushing towards Keternivka here. A lot of big, the Russians have made solid progress, especially in the Vodana and the mines here, because this allows them to encircle Vuhledar, but there's still some more things to do before they could capture Vuhledar. The main thing is that once they capture Vuhledar, they might try to take Nova Ukrainka and Bogdanovka, and then from here, if the Russians can do that, let's say, the front line goes something like this, then they're going to try to attack towards Uspenska. And then this is kind of like a logistics hub that controls all these villages here. Because then if Uspenska falls, then they could pull the front all the way up here. And if they take Charkovsk and Nova Zelanya, then this front line goes all the way here, and then from there they could start attacking Kurakova. And then at this point, the Russians might advance along the Kurakova reservoir and try to cut off Kurakova from the west, and then they could try to link up and encircle Kurakova. So that is kind of the main Russian plan, in just my estimation, in the Vuhledar direction. There's been some changes in the Zaporozhye direction, no changes in Kherson. The Russians are pushing towards Makharovka. We got some geolocated footage showing that the Russians are right in the southern part of Makharovka. So it looks like they're now trying to reach this small village. So they kind of advanced north from Starmayorska and have captured kind of these fields between Makharovka and Uruzhaina and Starmayorska, and looks like they're going to start battling for Makharovka. So small gains in this area. There's been small gains in Zaporozhye as well. In the Robotina area, the Russians have captured more fields to the north of it. I believe they have captured these fields here. So basically just trying to level the front a little bit here. And I believe that is it for the Zaporozhye direction. Alrighty, so that was the kind of the more southern direction. Now let us continue towards where the Russians also made a lot of big breakthroughs, the Tourette's direction. And as you can see, there's been huge changes from last time. So in the Tourette's direction, the Russians, I mean, I can't really even explain. There's been so much. So the biggest thing, the biggest news is the Russians have broken through into the citadel. So what do I mean by the citadel? So the main Ukrainian defenses were these high-rise buildings in the citadel and these giant Terraconn mines. And if these two areas fall, then Touretsk is done. The Russians will capture Touretsk if those two areas fall. And I was expecting that the Russians would try to bypass them instead of attacking directly. But maybe the Ukrainian defenses are so weak that they could just attack them directly. Now, what we saw this week is that the Russians have captured about half of this citadel area. So the Ukrainians are still in the western part here, but the Russians have captured all these high-rise buildings and have broken through into this high-rise citadel. And we actually have geolocated footage of that, so we know that this is the case. So this is a very big deal, because if the citadel falls, then they could encircle these mines from the north here. And my read of the situation was that, once they took these high-rise building areas right here, they could advance along the more easier residential areas and try to bypass this area from the north here. Try to take all these residential areas and just encircle it from the north here. But they opted for a direct attack. So this is the fact that they broke through here so easily is a very bad omen for the Ukrainians in Touretsk. It looks like this is where the Ukrainians are also pulled a lot of troops from. And as they broke through into this, there's been a lot of gains. We talked about how the Russians have completely captured the prison here. They have captured basically this entire residential area here. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians have taken this Terraconn as well. And so the breakthrough into the citadel is a very bad news for the Ukrainians in Touretsk here. Also, in the more southern part, the Russians have broken through. This is without geolocated confirmation, but a bunch of mappers have confirmed this, that the Russians have entered kind of the southern part right here. This is part of Touretsk, but it's like a southern micro-district. The Ukrainians do have the high ground, so they have these mines that overlook it, so they could have the dominant, they could see everything going on, but the Russians are still advanced from kind of their positions in Zeliznya here and captured the southern part of this micro district. So they captured this small Terraconn and captured a lot of these buildings to the south here. And so what the Russians will probably try to do is probably link up and try to basically link up these forces here and basically cut off all the Ukrainians that are in this forest, and then basically, then they could pull the front line up. If they could attack the citadel directly, then maybe they just storm these high Terraconns, but I don't think they'll do that. I think they'll continue battling. They'll try to capture the citadel. They'll try to capture most of this southern micro district, and then once they capture the citadel here, they'll continue pushing north here and try to split the defense of Touretsk in half here. So, and then from here, the Russians could overrun, kind of get to behind these giant mines and Terraconns. And where the Russians could actually, where the Russians made a big progress here is here. Now you can see this giant intrusion in the Ukrainian lines towards the village of Vuhledar here. And so we actually have geolocated footage of the Russians kind of attacking here with troops and disembarking, and pro-Russian sources say they have captured this entire village, this village right here. But we only have geolocated footage of them being disembarked right here. Now, if Vuhledar has fallen, then the Russians could basically kind of link up and completely capture the village of Nepalivka here and kind of pull up the front here and then use the rail line to advance towards the next Ukrainian positions in Shepardinivka and Petrivka, because these two small towns basically If these fall, then the Russians could overrun these Terracons from the west here, and they also have a rail line that they could use to advance along. So this also proves that New York has been completely captured by the Russians. There's been some sources show like a week or two ago that the Azov battalion tried to save the Ukrainians that are in this factory. So it's still a little bit of a fog of war. This is like the Russians have shown themselves to be here. The Ukrainians showed themselves to be here, but then they say they retreated. So there's still some in the New York direction. There's still a lot of kind of unknowns. Like there's a lot of contradictory evidence, and but it looks like the Russians have fully actually captured New York now. But we shall continue watching this with interest. So Kursk has been a very big bloodbath, and the breakthrough here has been very much in Russian favor so far. So we'll see if they continue breaking into Kursk itself, because the battle for that city has now officially begun. In the Chasiv Yar direction, the Russians have made a lot of solid progress here as well, mostly in trying to improve their positions on the other side of the canal so that they could start encircling Chasiv Yar. In the south here, we talked about how the Russians reached the canal from Klishevka and reached this area. And this week, we have confirmation the Russians have completely cleared this area. And not only that, they captured this forest right here. They actually had geolocated footage of the Russians being in this forest here. And so, looks like they even have a small little bridgehead on the other side of the canal here. And pro-Russian sources are saying that this area has also been captured. So basically, they have completely captured everything to the west of the canal. So I believe that is because there's like no reason for the Ukrainians to be here any longer because the Russians have completely captured it. So a lot of solid gains of the Russians in the southern Chasiv Yar direction. The Russians are also improving themselves in the north here. It looks like the main goal is to capture the village of Gridivka here, and the gains that we saw here is that the Russians have completely captured this area right here from the Ukrainians. And so, as you can see, they're moving along the canal. And I think we talked about this last week, but they also have a small bridgehead on the other side of Kalinova here. But I think we talked about that last week. But it looks like the goal is to actually reach Gridivka and take it, because then if they could capture Gridivka and kind of let's take at a global scope of this Chasiv Yar direction here. So if they capture Gridivka, and they capture, they've captured everything on the other side of the canal here. As you can see, they're actually even crossing it here. Is that then they could start encircling Chasiv Yar. And the two main goals is that, as you can see here, the main thing here is to capture the village of Stupochka here, and try to capture, this area. And then here is to capture this quarry mine right here. So that is the main. So once the Russians have secured themselves in Gridivka and have secured themselves, and have a bridgehead on the other side of the canal here, we can see that the Russians will try to storm and take this quarry right here, and then the other area is to storm Stupchka and take these small mines in Stupchka. Because at this point, if this is what happens, then they can start encircling Chasiv Yar proper. But those are what they have to storm if they want to start encircling Chasiv Yar. Because while the Russians have a small bridgehead in the Novi district here, the strongest positions are in the southern, in the central part of Chasiv Yar, with these high-rise building areas and this factory. So assaulting it directly will be a giant pain, and I think the Russians will prefer to do it to encircle it. So that is the global scope of the Chasiv Yar direction and how the Russians are. With the improvement of their positions on the flanks here, this gives them a better position to encircle it. There's actually been no changes in the Seversk direction. There's been a ton of updates in the Le Mans direction, and we haven't really seen this in a while. Let me take a swig of my water here. Damn. Anyway, yeah, I've been talking a lot. So there's been a lot of changes in the Le Mans direction. Let's talk about them. So the first thing is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Makivka. Now, the thing about Makivka is that it's split in two. There's a lot of positions in the western side of the village, But we actually have confirmation of the Russians being in this church here. We have geolocated footage of the Russians being in this area. So most Russian sources are saying that they have completely captured Makivka, but some pro-Ukrainian sources are saying there's still some battles going on here. But for all intents and purposes, Makivka has been completely captured by the Russians. And, I thought, from Makivka, they'd advance southward because, so Makivka has completely fallen. This has been a battle that's been going on for about a month now. So this was eventually going to happen, but one of the biggest changes was this area. So before, the Russians were, right here. And I'm like, okay, they're going to use Makivka to go down. But looks like they advanced directly, and maybe the Ukrainians pulled a bunch of troops from the Liman direction. But the Russians managed to break through and take the village of Nevsky. They actually raised their battle flag right here. So the village of Nevsky has been completely captured by the Russians, and not only that, they have captured the fields in this ravine here. And a lot of sources are saying that the Russians have completely from the Kivka to Nevsky, they have completely captured the fields here as well. But we don't have geolocated footage of that. And so, this is a big, this is, again, the Russians are trying to push the Ukrainians to the other side of the Zhirobets River. And from there, now with the fall of Nevsky and Makivka, the Russians will probably continue advancing south, and the next focus will be in the village of Nozodanovka and Terny. As we know, the Russians were trying to advance towards Terny, and they suffered a lot of losses trying to advance through the fields here. But if the Russians could capture Nozodanovka here, they could attack Terny from the north here, and Yampolovka, and then clear the fields here, and then just continue pushing, south until they reach Torskoye here, or maybe the northern outskirts of Torskoye, because then they could use the Zhirobets River as a natural defense for their western flank, but then they can continue advancing south and clearing these villages and pushing the Ukrainians on the other side of the Zhirobets River. Now, the Ukrainians have a bunch of defenses on the other side of the Zhirobets River, but if the Russians could push something like this gives them a better defensive position here to defend, but also but I don't think they'll continue advancing. I don't think they'll advance along the beyond the Zhirobets River. I think they're going to try to reach the Oskol and force the Ukrainians that are on this side of the Oskol River to retreat by attacking their flanks. We talked about how the Russians have completely captured Stimatovka, Mazhanovka, and Andriivka and captured these areas. And speaking of reaching the Oskol River, the biggest, where the Russians will probably have the best positions to do that is in the Pashana flower. So the Pashana flower is blooming. They captured Pashana about a month ago, but they have basically tried to expand in all directions. And in the last 2 weeks, this has been no exception. The Russians have captured this area. The Russians have captured this area. And I believe the Russians have captured this area. So these are the gains that the Russians have made in Pashana, and I believe this area too. So they're expanding in the north here, as we can see, in the south. And a lot of sources are saying that the main Russian push is trying to capture these three villages of Gasilovka, Klashenivka, and Krotoliivka. Because, and the biggest question is, when will the Russians, it looks like the Russians have secured their flanks in Pashana very solidly. And now the question is, when will the Russians do a direct attack to reach the Oskol River and reach it here and capture these three villages? Now, as you can see from the global scope here, in that if they reach here, there's a bit of a big salient. So, obviously they improve their flanks here, they could defend themselves, but this still leaves them vulnerable. So, what will they do? So, this is why they had to expand the Pashana flower, so that, they have a better position in attacking these three villages. But once they let's say they capture these three villages and reach the Oskol River, what is the goal? Well, they're going to do a repeat of what they did in 2022. So what they're going to try to do is they're going to continue pushing south here, and the next big obstacle will be the town of Borova, which is one of the biggest towns besides Liman on the other side of the Oskol River. But let's say they reach Borova. Well, then everything on this area between Stimatovka and these positions will have to be given up, because they could attack it from two directions. and then then the front line will go something like this, and then suddenly it's no longer a protrusion, but like a solid part of the front here. So they just continue pushing south. They'll try to take Borovia, try to continue pushing towards Lazova and along the Oska River, and then from Makivka and Nevsky, then the areas here will have to be given up, and they will have to fall back to Liman. And I think the Ukrainians will continue retreating until they'll try to secure themselves probably along the forests in Liman, but the Russians, everything to the north of this kind of red line here, generally speaking, will probably be swept up by the Russians. So the Russians won't do a direct attack. They don't have to do a direct attack on all these small little villages. They just have to break through to the other side of the Oskol and continue moving southwards. And if they do that, they could clear up these villages without a fight. And that could probably take like a month or two. We'll have to. It depends on how long it will take. But then the Ukrainians will fall back to their Kupiansk suburb defenses, which are pretty formidable, and then they'll also retreat to Liman because without the fall of Seversk, the Ukrainians could still supply the Ukrainian forces in these forests. It'll be very hard to try to take Yampil and Dobrivka and try to encircle Liman from the south here. They could try to attack Liman from the north here, but the Ukrainians could still supply it from the south here. So Liman will still be a bit of a trick to take, but that is kind of the main goal, is to take Liman. So that's what's happening in the Kupiansk and Liman direction. There's been some changes also in Sinkovka. They managed to take some positions to the south here, take this small little forest thing here, and they're trying to clear this forest between Liman, Pershing, and Sinkovka. So some small changes in that direction. In the Kharkov direction, there's not really that much changes. The Russians are back in the Lipsy dachas. We have geolocated footage of the Russians being in this area right here. We also have some footage showing the Russians are, by the end of this week, were attacking towards Tika. It looks like they're trying to take this small village back. But small changes in the Kharkov direction. Now, one of the biggest change. Now, this is actually, you might think, oh man, Kursk, maybe it's slow down, right? No. So I talked about all these, big gains and things like that. But one of the biggest changes in the last 2 weeks was the Russian Kursk counteroffensive. So, we talked about the Kursk offensive. It slowed down. There's been some small changes, but in the last week or two, there's been a huge change, and the Russians have attacked here. And there's a lot to talk about. Now, we could see this right here. So what happened? The Russians basically, in the town of Kornovo, they basically assembled a counteroffensive group and attacked the Ukrainians on their western part of their Kursk salient here. And one of the biggest things is that, not only did they clear the Ukrainians that were in Krasnoboroska and Kamnovka and basically ended the threat towards the southern part of Kornova, they retook the town of Snagnosk, and not only that, took these villages back and secured the border villages right here. But once that happened, the Russians continued making the pushes, and they battled and captured the village of Oponovka here. And not only that, they continue pushing, and the main Ukrainian defenses was now around Novononovka and Lubovka here, right here. And they were basically, this is where the Ukrainians were trying to hold their positions, and now the Russians have reached the main Ukrainian defenses, and this could cut off all the Ukrainians that are battling in the north here. And the Russians took Pokrovsky here and are now battling for Libanovka here, but they have not captured it. So the Ukrainians were able to hold the Russians here, but the Russians are now trying to break through here. Russian sources are saying they took the village of Dornovka and Nikolaeva Dorona here, and they say they continued advancing and are now battling for Sedrnovka here, because while they couldn't break through towards this main defense line here, if they could take this village, this cuts off the main highway that supports all the Ukrainians that are in this positions. Now they could use Suchka for their highway system, but that will it's a bit out of the way here. So a lot of big changes in the Kursk direction, and um, what I think the Russians will try to do is continue advancing along the borderlands here and try to cut off Suchka from the south here and try to reach this highway and cut it. And we actually see that the Russians are trying to push from here. So we talked about how the Russians have recaptured the village of Borky, and now the Russians are trying to battle for the village of Pilanovka here. Now the Ukrainians are still in control of this village. They have prevented the Russians from taking it, but the Russians have been bombing this and trying to storm it. And the main purpose of that is because then they could continue. This is the pesky river, and they want to reach it because then if they reach here, they could then try to cross it and take Gornal and Guvko and try to advance towards the highway here from the south and try to link up with the Russians advancing from the south here. That way they could put this entire area, because imagine this, then this basically becomes a giant cauldron for the Ukrainians. Now the Ukrainians seeing this are trying to stop it at every possible angle. And they activated in the southern part of the Kursk direction. So they're trying to reach Gluzovka because then this kind of cuts off. This will put a. If the Ukrainians could push towards Gluzovka, they could then attack the Russians behind them as they advance towards there. So the Ukrainians started to attack here. And the main battles are going on for the village of Visola here. So the Visola is the main village the Ukrainians need to take if they want to reach Gluzovka. But the Russians are holding on for this for dear life. The Ukrainians have crossed the borderlands and have captured the borderland villages of Mazovka, Obod. This map still shows that this is under Russian control, but these villages are probably under Ukrainian control, and they're now trying to storm Visola. But the Russians are, there was a bunch of geolocated footage to the east of Visola showing a bunch of Ukrainian armor being destroyed. So the battle for Visola is ongoing, and the Ukrainians need to take this village in order to attack towards Gluzovka. But this forces the Russians to kind of basically prevent themselves from, they can't put, they have to keep their eyes alert for this area, but they also have to keep, as they continue pushing towards this way. So right now we actually only have geolocated footage of the Russians being in this area, and they have raised their flags in Stagnowsk. But I wouldn't be surprised if they took these villages. So we shall see if the Russians, could take Startanovka here and continue pushing towards the highway here. So we shall see. I'm kind of surprised. If I was the Russians, I'd try to maybe, advance into Sumy, and instead of trying to, maybe there's some natural defenses here. I don't know. Maybe try to flatten the front here and or something. But we shall see. So yeah, the Russian Kursk counteroffensive has begun. A lot of big gains for the Russians here, but Ukrainians are still trying to hold on to their Kursk gains here. So yeah, that's a lot of changes. This was a big video, but I had to go over what's happened in the last 2 weeks. Sometimes I talk about the gains on the ground because that's what matters. How do I say it? That's not what matters, is that's what I like focusing on. I like focusing on the territorial changes and what the Russians are pushing towards and their kind of tactical, operational strategy here. But that's what I like talking about. But there's also the strategic considerations of what's going on beyond that. And what I mean by that is that, we talked about how the Ukrainians are trying to propose a peace plan. There's all these weapons deals that are going on. So, but I don't like talking about that. I like just talking about kind of the battlefield thing. So, yeah, so that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Be sure to, I'm sorry for me coughing and sneezing and shit like that. But, yeah, this was a big video. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Give this video a thumbs up if you like the video. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue seeing these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates. Comment your thoughts of what you're thinking going on in this war. And I hope you guys have a very blessed day. So aim high and wander on.